I'd like to say very much welcome to everybody on behalf of the BCS, of the Quality Specialist Group, of the Business Change Specialist Group, of what Soya here with us, who is actually chair for the Business Change Specialist Group, also for the Hampshire branch. And we have a fantastic session today. And this is the first of a group of 4 sessions. The next one is a month on, and we have Sue Turner, and she is actually talking again about getting going with quality. And we have 2 sessions in May on the 24th and 25th of May, but those will be in the afternoon rather than the evening. And one is targeted very much at senior management, whereas the other one is more a sort of technical session to do with the sort of concepts of quality and getting this quality processes in place. So do keep an eye on the quality specialist groups and business change specialist groups in the Hampshire branch, and you'll see some interesting things coming up. And certainly on the branch ones, you'll see some other ones that are on quality that might actually be of interest to you. Now, just a couple of the housekeeping things. Obviously, we'd like everybody to remain muted during the presentation. We will be recording this, but we'll start, I'll be passing shortly across onto Arthur Hill, and we'll start the recording at that point, and Arthur will be actually introducing Bal, and at the end of Bal's presentation, I'll actually stop the recording, and Arthur will be carrying on dealing with all the questions and answers. Now, the PowerPoint, Bal is going to send them to me, and I'll get them put up on the website together with the link for the recording, hopefully when everything works. Now, we're not taking any questions during, so the recording is much more straightforward and more useful afterwards. But please, as you think about anything, could you put it in the chat room? Because Arthur will then pick it up and Julie sort of raise these points at the end. So at that stage, just to recap, we will be recording, but not the question and answers. Questions, please, into the chat or at the end. And I'd like to pass across now, and I'll be at the stage closing my microphone and screen to give us maximum effect of actually passing on the technology side of things. So at that stage, I'll pass across to Arthur Hill. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Thanks for the handover. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to see that we've got a very good audience for Bal this evening. Just a little bit of background. I've known Bal probably for about 30 years. I have to admit that it's been a long working knowledge. Bal's an extremely experienced auditor who has international experience looking at software and engineering companies across the world. And I think what Bal brings to the party really is his experience of how different companies operate, the types of problems that they tend to run into, and some common factors that perhaps might help others to not run into the same problems. So I'll leave Bal to introduce himself formally, and as Margaret said, I'll be moderating the questions at the end. So Bal's going to speak for about 40 minutes or thereabouts, and then we've got 20 minutes to cope with any questions at the end. So I like Margaret, I'm going to shut up now and disappear, but I will be lurking in the background, ready for when Bal finishes his talk. So thank you very much for joining us. I'll look forward to your feedback. So bye for now.
Thanks, Arthur. So thanks everyone for joining us, and this talk is going to be teaching you how to be a bit like a magician. So how can you identify a problem project before they actually start to fail? You know, it reminds you of one of those little acts, you know, where the guy goes, give us a number, or split the cards, and then they be able to predict the card. Well, it is a little bit like that, but there's some science behind this. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. And So I'll just start off a little bit about myself. So I graduated back in '82, so you can probably work out roughly what my age is. I originally worked in the defence industry, and I went from a graduate engineer to head of design assurance, and then eventually to a quality manager. I've been involved in auditing, consultancy and training since 1992. And I was party to when the Ticket Plus scheme, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, was set up and established back in 1992. So currently I spend a lot of time doing audits, mainly on the ICT type environment. And I also do World Lottery security audits, cyber essentials. I'm a certified ethical hacker and also a certified security analyst. Now, just to sort of get some context, there's the idea of failed projects or problem projects. It's not new. It's not going to go away. It's always going to be there. And it's not the fact that you have some issues on a project. It's how early you detect that it is a problem project and what you do about it that makes a difference. Now, it impacts all sorts of companies, and it is very, very expensive because it erodes the margins when you're actually trying to resolve those issues. And obviously, people add contingency into the cost estimates, but of course, like then that makes it uncompetitive. So the better you are at managing your problem projects before they actually become failures or prevent them from being failures, the better you are at doing that, the better your margins will be, the better your customer satisfaction will be. You know, everybody wins. So now the traditional way of handling this is that at the end of most projects, an organization will have what they call a lessons learned review. And what that review is designed to do is help them understand why that project hasn't performed as well as they'd expected it to. Now, I think there's a good place for these lessons learned, but you can actually get more from that activity, that post-project review, the lessons learned review. A lot of organizations that I come across, they don't actually get the return that they could get from those lessons learned. And that's what this presentation will hopefully give you an insight into. Now, the cost of project failures can actually be huge. And here's just an example of some, 28 million, 60 million, and all the way down to here, 4.8 billion. It's almost eye-watering, isn't it? And obviously these are big projects, but it's all relative. Every organization that does IT projects will have and will have had and will probably have in the future some problem projects. And what we want to try and do is in this presentation is try and understand what can we do about it? How can we identify them before they actually start hurting us? So let's just reflect a little bit about the traditional approach. Now all methodologies, agile, waterfall, iterative, they all will have a way of the team having some reflection at the end and thinking, well, what could we have done better? What were the cause of problems? And what happens is that they end up with a very good understanding of why that particular project ran into difficulties, and maybe what could have been done in that instance to avoid it. But what then they do is they go on to then create some lists, create some actions on people, maybe even if they're sort of above average, they will create a database of lessons learned. This use of the lessons learned data is very variable. Sometimes quality managers or department managers will update their templates based on experience or feedback from these lessons learned. They'll generate this knowledge base that they can use on future projects when they're planning future projects. They might even identify training weaknesses and try and improve the competency of the teams going forward. Risk is a big thing as well. So if you can identify risks and manage them better, then that usually helps as well. The difficulty is it's variable. And for each of these issues, as you can sort of like identify these things, the whole thing moves. So the next project won't quite be the same type of project. It won't be the same complexity. Maybe the last project was an innovative R&D project. Well, the next project might be a transformation project. And because the nature of the projects is different and the processes that use it are different, the players are different, then sometimes that limits the usefulness of the knowledge that comes out of these lessons learned. So the problem we've got then is, on these projects that have had these problems, well, we've already missed the deadline. We've already overspent. And now we've got an unhappy customer, and we might even have a dispute on our hands that the customer doesn't want to pay their bill. Now, a lessons learned isn't going to make that go away. A lesson learned review is not going to make that go away. But what if we did have an early warning system? What if we had something the equivalent of a radar system or a sonar system, some form of monitoring system that would trigger some pings or some alarms, early warning signals that would mobilize the management and maybe the architects or the team leaders, project managers, and mobilize them into doing things that would avoid the problems or maybe resolve them before they start eroding the margins. And that's what I'm going to try and point out of what's available to help us establish this sort of early warning system. Now, they're not new, are they, these early warning systems? We have them for tsunamis, earthquakes, landslides, floods. We already have these things. And typically, they're based on these 4 steps being in place. Some sort of knowledge about the risks that we're going to encounter, a monitoring system that is looking for the triggers, constantly monitoring for the triggers. But just identifying the triggers isn't enough, you see. What needs to happen is that when those triggers appear and the monitoring detects that there's a potential for a volcanic activity or tsunami or earthquake, then that information has to get to the people that could do something about it. Maybe do the evacuation, maybe do the preparation, get the food or the shelters prepared. So the idea is disseminate and communicate that knowledge so that we can deploy a response. But we need to be able to plan those things. We need to have a response capability already in hand to know what are we going to do when these signals appear? Who do we need to tell? And then those people need to be prepared to listen and hear the warnings. So I'm going to talk about these 4 steps now and how we can do them in a project environment. Now, in terms of an early warning system for projects, first of all, we need to obtain the knowledge, build a baseline of understanding of why our projects fail. And they'll be different for different organizations. So, but the idea now is we're going to still do those lessons learned, but what we're going to do is we're going to sort of like try and identify patterns. So we want to sort of like look for what it is that we would be monitoring, what would be our triggers. And these things, what we want to do is try and see how do they evolve? How would they appear over time? So that we can sort of see them coming and go, oh, well, if this happens next, then that is a trigger. So I'll give you some examples in a short while. Now, the key thing about this early warning system, it's no good just knowing. We've got to be able to get through to the people who can do something about it. And they should be prepared to listen. So they need to have a little bit of an awareness of what do these signals mean, and some pre-prepared plans of the actions they would take if certain warnings came in a certain sequence. And that in itself becomes our response capability. So an awareness by the management team or the response team is key. Otherwise, we end up with warnings and we still end up with the lessons learned, and we understand why these projects fail, but we fail to do anything about them. We fail to use the triggers. So we don't want to be in that position. So the first step then is to obtain the knowledge. But of course, like we've been doing lessons learned for ages. So if there is some sort of knowledge there, it's ideal. You know, we need to sort it in a way that we can use it for comparable analysis. Now, the difficulty here is complexity. Different projects will have different complexity. And if you try and compare data from a sort of an innovative, complex project with one that is straightforward and simple, or a transformation project with an R&D project, an R&D innovative design project, then the data really isn't compatible. It's a bit like comparing apples and pears. So what we need to do is do a little bit of analysis, forward thinking, and look at our development life cycle. And there's lots of life cycles out there, you know, but typically they all have phases. They'll all have stages. They'll all have checkpoints. So what we need to do is try and understand our life cycle and interpret how we can collect data to make informed decisions. Now, the key thing here is what we're going to do is we're going to take the data that we collect, and in order to use it, we need to change it to information. And in order to make that information useful, we need to change it to knowledge. So there's a process for doing this. And what it is it's having a vision. And the idea of having this vision is that we've almost got to look forward and sort of say, look, these are the sort of reasons our projects typically fail. Or what data could we collect reasonably without creating an overhead, without sort of making life really difficult for ourselves? What's easily accessible in terms of data that we have already, maybe financial data, maybe project reporting, it's already there, and use that data such that we can understand it, make it into information, and then use it as a knowledge base. So I'm going to use two examples later, one for a waterfall project and one for an agile project, just as an example to show how it could work. Now, in order to make this data compatible, we need to categorize the different types of projects that we do. So I mentioned earlier, innovative projects will be different to R&D projects, different to implementation projects, different to transformation projects. So at the start of a project, we need to categorize what type of project it is. And then we need to sort of have a way of working out its complexity. So is it straightforward? Is it very sort of complex? Is it very challenging? Or is it one that we've done many times before? Similar, you know. So, and when we categorize them like that, that means that the data that we collect for those categories will be comparable. And then every one of these projects, once you've categorized them, will have certain phases, such as initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. And we can then collect data on how well we do those phases of those projects. So we're going to monitor the phases within the categories, and that should mean that we can then start comparing. Now, of course, like part of project management is to tailor the rules, tailor the project to suit the circumstances. So what we need to do is have some rules about what we can and cannot tailor so that the projects can work in an established way so that we can compare them. Now, that might sound like a bit of an overhead, but it's not really, because the projects will all go through a planning phase. They'll all go through an executing phase. They'll all go through a closing phase. And they'll always have some involvement of monitoring and controlling. So what we need to do is identify common threads across even the tailored projects within each category. So the challenge of categorizing them is tackled by creating established ways of working. This is what's going to make the data compatible. And in a couple of slides' time, I'll show you how we can get to that stage. Now, what I talked about triggers earlier, the things that would trigger the alarms that would get people to act on the early warning system. Well, we use the knowledge from our lessons learned to give us some sort of idea of what we could be monitoring. Now, it's going to be different because we maybe haven't been looking at them in terms of the categories that we've just come up with, but we can easily do a bit of reverse engineering and work that out and sort of sort out the data so that it is compatible. Now, the sort of typical things that you could start with here are cost to complete. All projects have a cost to complete, and most projects will have some form of reporting to the finance team of what their cost to complete was predicted to be throughout the project, maybe on a monthly basis, maybe on a phase basis. They'll also have a way of monitoring change requests. And it's not a case of if change requests. It's always a part of, particularly software projects. There's always change requests. And stakeholder participation, particularly customer as a stakeholder, but it doesn't have to be customer, but stakeholder participation. Resource availability. Project managers often change during a project. Now, most projects can cope quite easily with project manager changing once. Problems start happening when the project manager changes 2, 3, 4 times during the life of the project. So these are all easy, low-hanging fruit for monitoring. But of course, like, you will come up with some of your own, which are peculiar to your organization. So I'm going to use 2 examples. One, stakeholder involvement on an agile project. Sometimes it's called customer representative product owner. And the second one I'm going to use is the number of change requests in a waterfall project for an innovative design type project. Now, when we get to that, that'll be in a couple of slides' time. When we get to step 3 of this, developing this early warning system, this is where we worked out what we are monitoring and what the triggers will be. And what we've got to do is we've got to be able to track and spot our triggers. And typically, projects will do some sort of project status reporting. There'll be some dashboards. There might even be some scorecards. So those things already exist. And what we need to do is adapt them to be part of our early warning system. But this data, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk a bit about it more on the next slide, it needs to be collected on established processes. And I use the word established because I'm going to explain what that is in a while. And the data needs to be readily available. We don't want to create overheads of collecting the data. So wherever possible, like for instance, the number of change requests, well, project managers should know that anyway. The number of workshops, the number of demonstrations, we should know that. So we're not really creating a massive overhead to collect this sort of data. But we also need to sort of think about normalizing it, because some projects will last 3 months, other projects will last 6 months, some projects might last 2 years, some projects might have 5 engineers, some might have 20. So we need to consider how we can normalize the data to help make it compatible. Now, I'm going to introduce this established processes a little bit now. The process assessments is well known and well established. There's a Ticket Plus scheme here in the UK, and we've got some talks on that over the next couple of months. Margaret will tell you more about it. There's the CMMI process, which is widely used in America for Department of Defense. And there's the SPICE process, which is the process assessment system that's used for the European Space Agency. Now, the thing about it, all of these things talk about going through some levels. And one of those levels, level 3, is about established. So in 15504, the standard, it calls it established. And in CMMI, it calls it defined. And in Ticket Plus, we call it silver. Now, if you compare it with 2 earlier levels, which are foundation and bronze, the idea is that when an organization first starts its management systems, we call it level 1, where the chance of the project succeeding or the chance of the project failing, depends on which way you look at it. So it is like a distribution. And as you go through to managed, as you start managing these processes, you get less chance. So this becomes more of a defined normal distribution. You get less chance of the projects failing. And then as you get through to established, there's even less. But obviously there's still some chance of the projects getting into difficulty, but there's less projects. So and then there are 2 more maturity levels, which are about improving using quantified methods and metrics. But the target should be for us to be established. And what this means is that we have an established way of working. We are running our projects consistently. All of the projects will have a project plan. All of the projects will do a project status report on a regular frequency. All the projects will have a risk register. They are working in an established way. When organizations first start with management systems, very often the project, like if you think of a process like project management process or a change management process, well, what happens is the process does what it says on the tin. Project management process will manage the projects, and the change management process will manage the changes. The difficulty is it might not do it very efficiently, might not do it very effectively, it might need a lot of rework before that project actually does deliver. It might need a lot of retries before the change is actually successful. But we do get there. We lose margin a lot of the time, not all the time, but we lose our margins a lot of the time. When you get to manage, here we start managing the process and managing the outputs. And what happens is that we understand more than, we understand the need to have trained people, to have checkpoints, to have react to the reporting. So what we're actually doing is managing the process to achieve our outcomes. When we get to established, this is where the stage where we start sort of saying, well, look, there is a good way of doing these things, and this is our way of doing it. And we want all project managers to use a consistent template for their project management plan. That means that as we do our lessons learned and we improve the way that we want to manage our projects, we update our templates, we update our project managers training, we update our project monitoring and reporting, and all of the future projects benefit. Whereas at lower levels, because it's not done consistently, 1 or 2 projects might benefit from that lesson. But a lot of them, where the project managers are sort of a law unto themselves, will sort of say, well, I'm using my own template. I have my own risk register template and I'm going to use that. So they don't benefit from the lessons learned. So what we want to do is have consistent, established way of working. We want to try and pitch at this level so that the triggers for the early warning system can work effectively. So all projects should at this stage be using an approved, adapted version of our standard processes. That should be our target. It's not going to happen overnight, but the Ticket Plus scheme, and you've got some talks on it in the coming weeks, will help you get to that level. So here's an example of how, if we've collected data on, say, the last 10 projects on how well we've done the joint reviews, demonstrations and workshops, the stakeholder or customer involvement during the requirements phase. And what we can sort of see is that a couple of the projects that actually did become problem projects, because this is historical data, had very little attendance at the workshops and demos during the requirements phase. And we can sort of see that they were problem projects later. So using that data, we then come up with some sort of system for working out where our triggers will be for our early warning system. So if we have the requirements phase, we're just looking at the requirements phase, then what we can do is we can sort of say, if the joint reviews, demos and workshops have some sort of place where the customers can get a look and feel and we can get feedback from them on whether we're on the right track. And these are normalized figures where we're sort of indicating that if it's below 4 and above or above 7, we want to have a special look at it. So we could plot where our project is at the end of the requirements phase. And if it's down here, we know that alarm bells might start ringing. And if it's up here, alarm bells might start ringing. On a similar front, if we take change requests on a waterfall project. So here we've got a couple of projects that had hardly any change requests early on. And so when we've collected that data, we also knew how that project ended up. So we know that the outliers were the problem projects. Not 100% guaranteed, but now we've got a warning system. So when something comes out of this upper and lower limit, when we're monitoring it, we can dive in there and say, let's understand why we haven't got the number of change requests that we would have expected on a project of this complexity, of this category. We would have expected more changes or we would have expected less changes. And that means that then we can hopefully do something about it, because if the customer's not playing his part, we've now got an early warning signal to sort of say, look, in this sort of scenario, we would have expected you to have come up with some change requests around our understanding of your requirements or your sponsor's description or requirements. They should have been refined by now through a better understanding of where we're going with our solution. So once we've got those monitoring systems in place, they can be transferred into key performance indicators. They will help us to respond to these detection of these early warning signals. And the sort of things that we're already doing, the project status report, the project reviews, phase reviews, gate reviews, checkpoints, health check, all of these can use those triggers usefully. So we're not doing anything other than what we did before. But now what we've got is we've got knowledge. We've changed that data into information, and we've changed that information into knowledge. We've then established a monitoring system and an early warning system that triggers when certain knowledge triggers are identified. So then what we've got to do is we've got to communicate those signals to somebody who can do something about it, which would often be the managers, the project managers, the risk manager, the operations manager, the group manager, the technical manager, whoever it is in your organization. So it might be somebody different regarding stakeholder involvement. It might be somebody different if it was relating to code reviews. It might be somebody different if it was relating to test defects. So the idea then is that what we should be able to do is, where we were before, we were hitting the dartboard, and sometimes we would hit the bullseye, project would go fine. But other times we would miss it. We'd miss the bullseye, but we would still be on the dartboard. But it was unpredictable. So then what we do is we identify our knowledge, start monitoring, start the feedback, start getting these people to act on those early warning signals and triggers. So now we're heading them off at the pass. A lot of these projects are not failing, less are failing. We're getting more closer to the bullseye. And finally, if we carry on with this, and we're sort of monitoring and reacting in good time, we should end up at the level 4. And this would be like round level 3. So the idea is that what we would have done by then is we'll have set up a system to be able to predict project performance through project monitoring, and using our knowledge from previous projects. So what we've done now is we've made our lessons learned come alive. We've started using it. We've started using it in a way that we can have this vision of where we want to go. Where we're not just looking backwards now. We're not just looking at and understanding why our projects failed. Now what we're doing is we're taking that knowledge of why our projects failed in the past, and we're creating this vision to sort of say, look, we want to get better at planning. We want to get better at resourcing. We want to get better at involving our stakeholders. We want to do better at managing our project requirements, monitoring our cost of completion, manage our risk. Now, if we want to get better at these, what is it that would be the warning? What would be the trigger to sort of say that it's going off track? Think of it like cutting an expensive material, an expensive piece of wood, an expensive cloth, and you draw a little line on it. It's how soon do you detect that you're going off the line? Because once you've cut it, it's gone. So we need to have this vision. So we can almost start by going back to our lessons learned of failed projects, and think, what is it that we would like to get better at? And what is it that we could collect and plot to identify where our lower limit would be and our higher limit? And then that would help us identify the processes that we want to move to established level and have them at a level where they can be comparable. So hopefully that's given you some food for thought in terms of how we can move from just understanding why projects fail to actually influencing how they can sort of be successful and avoid the pitfalls of becoming another statistic in the failed projects arena. So thanks very much everyone for listening.